Session, and you can say insight into the writing of Ousmane Sembène, who is presented today by Ekua Agha, who is basically looking at the genre of his work. Introduction to you.
Okay, Ekua Agha, thank you, Jeremiah, for that lovely introduction as well. I started off with a BA in political science, but also understanding that politics was also part of African history as well. Because when you're looking at politics, you're looking at history, you're looking at literature, you're looking at obviously business as well. Because to study that continent, you have to make sure that it's all done in its entirety as opposed to being split. And when I went in to do a master's in French and Francophone studies at the University of Westminster, I was taken into this wonderful world of what was called the discourse of colonialism and post-colonialism. Through reading and research. And along the way, we were introduced to the world of Frantz Fanon, the world of Aimé Césaire. These are writers who were writing during the French colonial era, who were actually now looking at the psychological damage that colonialism had actually done. And when we say psychological, it's not about the sort of obvious, people are still walking around, people are professionals, people are still living, but there is something that was done to the psyche of, all colonized people. Along the way, these writers stood their ground and started reading in between the lines. Why is it that the negative representations of Africa are still around after all the research that people had also done? Ousmane Sembène was from that school of thought as well, because you had writers who actually looked beyond the colonial education system and suddenly started finding out that apparently the system, especially the curriculum, was written in such a way to still promote an agenda. Ousmane Sembène started questioning the idea of why it was that even after independence, in so-called African countries who had living languages, that languages, the languages that were now still used, to develop or to continue, to move Africa away from the from the colonial struggle, was still the language of the colonizer. Either French or English language. And this is where he started questioning, why this was happening.
So before we go on to the body and motivation behind his work, I still want to look at your take, where you're coming from. In terms of your research as an educator and as an educational provider, okay? In terms of studying your studies, post-colonialism, again, is a particular area, it's a genre. So can you explain a little bit more about what that means? I mean, obviously, again, that's what we're going to discuss in the body of work, but, what can we expect when you're studying post-colonialism? What does post-colonialism mean?
Yes, okay. When we say post-colonialism, we're actually talking about the legacy of colonialism.
Right.
That legacy, what was actually left behind
Right, okay.
And also, we're now looking at an era of what we actually call the neo, a new form of colonialism happening. Because the post means we got independence. How come we are still in, a sort of a time warp where when you go back into history, you actually still see that most of the structures, that were imposed, on psychological or physical or mental structures that was imposed have not been removed.
They're still being imposed.
They're still imposed, but
Yeah.
really from a new perspective.
Yes.
And now the idea of the post is
Yeah.
who were the people who are now
Yeah.
using this kind of tools,
Yes.
and we're looking at different kind of tools. Is it a language? Is it the institutions? Remember that those institutions were not broken away.
Yeah.
The institutions were not reinvented. They were not kind of looked at properly and said, okay, these were the institutions that were actually imposed on us.
Right. Okay.
How are we going to move away from them?
Okay, so essentially the area of study is looking at an imperialist regime or agenda having contact with Africa, setting up, as you say, the institutions and places where imperialism can flourish, and yet after the colonial era, the abolition as part of that as well, of an enslavement of human beings, those institutions are still there. They haven't been addressed as being, part of that colonial era, and actually it's a new era, so why they're still there?
Why they're still there, and that's the question. I mean, when we say institutions, I'm not saying blow the buildings away. I mean, buildings are there, but what is going on in these buildings? The documents that were used, the school curriculum that was systematically used, to just actually produce certain elites.
Yes. Yeah.
The banking system that was used, that monetary system that was actually introduced, that was used as a form of exchange.
Okay.
The exchange has always been an unequal exchange.
Okay.
That exchange is still unequal. We look at the schools, even the churches, the religious organizations that came into Africa, to actually tell us that our own culture or what we had on the ground.
Okay, we're going to get to that bit soon as well, because again, Sembene actually addresses that in one of his films.
Yes, he does.
So basically, as an educator, your background is in African development, again including neo-imperialism in a post-independent Africa, and obviously the definitions for those being doing case studies, various specialist research, the impact, the human impact, the psychological extremes of the interaction of that agenda, and then of course going over into the social barriers and the issue of the diaspora and the home front as well.